Okay, so I think we'll still be waiting for folks to trickle in as we get the session underway. But thank you all for joining us today. As mentioned to folks who had already joined in, please feel free to share your name, organization, and where you're joining us from in the chat over the course of the intro to the session. My name is Naomi Wolf, and this is my colleague Neelafar Motat, and we are facilitating today on behalf of ICLEI Canada. This session is also offered through the Green Municipal Fund, which is delivered by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which is a program or whose programs are funded by the Government of Canada. Now, before getting started, we wanted to open today's session with a land acknowledgement. ICLEI Canada's work happens across Turtle Island, which has traditionally been and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples since time immemorial. We recognize that reconciliation is a fundamental component to building resilient communities and are committed to strengthening relationships with Indigenous groups and knowledge keepers, knowing that reconciliation requires ongoing learning, unlearning, reflection, and action. I am calling in today from Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The city is also covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Now, before jumping into today's session, I want to return to this practice of relationships and relationship building, acknowledging that as someone who has lived here my whole life, my own ability to live, work, and play on this land must go hand in hand with shifting my own relationship to this place, its history, and the people who live on and steward this land and have done so for time immemorial, and to do so through learning, reflection, and meaningfully engaging. Similarly, incorporating equity into the work that we do as climate practitioners cannot take place without intentional, respectful, and reciprocal relationship building based in listening, learning, and building foundations for trust. Thank you. Now, the next 2 hours are going to be jam-packed. They will feature 2 short presentations that highlight some key principles and tools related to inclusive and equitable adaptation, alongside activities that aim to get you thinking about how to start embedding these principles into the work that you do. We'll also be joined by a guest speaker, Sara MacRae from Dufferin County, who will be sharing about how equity and inclusion have been centered as foundations for decision-making in their Resilience Hub work. I also want to note before we get started that what we discuss here is just a starting point for action. As you will see throughout, equitable adaptation isn't a one-time event or a single action that must be checked off of a list. It is a process that must be based in intentional, ongoing efforts to shift how decisions are made and how power is shared to help build a climate resilient future for all. Now, to get things started, we're going to launch a short poll to help warm up the space and get people sharing. So please take a second to offer 3 to 5 words on what climate adaptation and/or climate resilience mean to you. If you finished the poll and you haven't yet shared your name, organization, and where you're joining from, feel free to please do so in the chat. Let's give it a few more seconds before we continue on. I think we can end the poll. Perfect. We can. Okay. Great. So here are some of the answers up on the screen. So we have some of the answers: nature-based solutions, better health and quality of life for all people. Climate adaptation is strengthening capacity to cope with and be prepared for the impacts of climate change and climate hazards. I won't go through all of them, but the ability to pivot, freshwater balance, healing, managing change, building strength for change. These are all really great answers. So thank you all for sharing. So stop sharing now and let's jump into things. If I can get my mouse to work. Okay, great. So having grounded ourselves in a bit of what climate adaptation and climate resilience can mean, want to move on to this slide, this quote, this statement that some of you may have seen or have some understanding of in the work that you do. But the impacts of climate change will not be experienced in the same way by all people. Similarly, the way in which we plan and respond to climate impacts cannot be uniform. This is where the conversation on equity and adaptation comes in. So I shared a quote here up on the screen from the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And I think it's a great example or helpful definition for distinguishing between equality and equity. Whereas equality means providing the same to all, equity means recognizing that we do not all start from the same place and must acknowledge and make adjustments for these imbalances. The process is ongoing, requiring us to identify and overcome intentional and unintentional barriers arising from bias or systemic structures. So when it comes to equitable frameworks and climate adaptation, it's about moving away from this idea of a one-size-fits-all solution. Equitable frameworks recognize that different communities and individuals come to the adaptation conversation with distinct experiences in relation to climate change that are informed by different social conditions and systems of power, which shape how these impacts are felt. One thing I do want to talk about, briefly is that these differentiated experiences are often referred to as vulnerabilities or vulnerability in the work that we do. And this is an important formula in a lot of ways for adaptation work and adaptation planning. However, this term can also be a problem, especially when it is applied to the description of communities. It doesn't really adequately capture the way that systemic inequities and systems of power shape social and community context, health and healthcare, economic stability, natural and physical environment, etc. And it often also fails to acknowledge the agency, expertise, and skills that people who have been historically labeled as vulnerable possess. In many ways, it's been historically used to refer to communities in such a way that removes agency and erases the systems of power and privilege that have shaped these determinants. So in many ways, it removes accountability. While conversations continue on how to best approach this terminology, regardless, it is essential that climate adaptation consider these differentiated experiences in order to ensure that meaningful and effective adaptation can take place. Now, to just share a quick anecdote, I was working on a project a few months ago, and in one of the conversations I was having with the project partner, he really emphasized that equity and adaptation are inherently bound. You can't have adaptation for all if equity and equitable approaches are not embedded into that process. And so it must be an inherent part of the work that we do. Now, to ground us a bit in the history of how equity has been approached or not been approached in municipal adaptation planning. Planning processes led by municipalities and supported by various professional sectors have long denied the rights, needs, and experiences of equity-deserving and denied groups. These are many of the processes through which increased risk of climate impacts has been compounded, right? Pushing racialized communities into undesirable geographic locations through processes of urban renewal, cutting accessible and affordable transit service, making decisions for communities instead of with communities. Engagement with the public, especially equity-denied and deserving groups, has largely been meant to placate rather than listen and respond to the needs of communities. And so this isn't just saying, far in history, this is something that is a recent way in which this conversation has been approached and in some ways still is. Engaging, and so this might look like engaging with different communities, but not incorporating what is heard into the actual work being done and not being accountable to those you have engaged. And these types of processes can lead to an erosion of trust in local governments, which then impacts the ability to meaningfully engage moving forward. Municipalities need to engage in processes of trust building, harm reduction, and restorative justice. However, this requires recognizing that the historical relationship of local governments has in some ways inflicted harm in the first place. Learning is an important step towards inclusive adaptation, and there are questions that local governments must ask of themselves in order to start building relationships, engaging meaningfully, and being able to put the lessons learned into place. It's important that we are now taking the time to shift the relationship that exists between municipalities and the communities that have and communities that have been historically marginalized. So making the shift towards inclusive and equitable adaptation can start with a few key actions. Recognizing the power dynamics between decision-making actors and community members is an important starting point. Asking and reflecting on where power needs to be given back to communities when it comes to local decision-making. But this also requires knowledge of what those existing power dynamics are. Some of the tools or resources that can help with starting this process can be internal trainings, workshops, and knowledge building more generally. Challenging patterns of behavior that perpetuate inequities and not even patterns of participation in decision-making. So one of the things that we've learned is that a fear of doing things wrong can be a barrier to taking action. Learning about privilege and past and ongoing harms can be uncomfortable, but reflecting on whether or not this discomfort is stopping you from making change is an important part of the process. One other aspect to this is considering how to build accountability into processes. This means, after decisions have been made, how are you going back to the communities that have helped to inform that decision-making? How do you follow up after an action has been implemented to leave room for changes to be made in the future? And the third point that I'll share here is acknowledging that communities and marginalized community members are active agents of change. Communities aren't being empowered. They already have the tools and knowledge to make that change. And one of the things that came up in a previous workshop I ran was that often the ways that privilege is recognized or approached can also erase tools and assets, such as intimate social networks that often exist in equity deserving and denied communities. So it's important to ask, how does your work recognize the expertise of each person who comes to the table? What does leadership look like within different communities? And how are you building partnerships and relationships that recognize this leadership? Part of incorporating equity into adaptation means moving from a top-down approach to one that centers the voice of equity denied and deserving communities. So the last slide I'll share before we move into our activity is that it can be helpful when starting to apply equity to the work that you're doing, starting to incorporate and embed it, to recognize what the equity objectives of your work are, especially when approaching new projects. So the breakdown that I shared on the screen here comes from the USDN Guide to Equitable Community-Driven Climate Preparedness, and it recognizes 3 types of objectives. So we have procedural objectives, which are typically process-oriented. They emphasize equitable treatment, and this is often where engagement comes into the process. Then we have distributional equity, which focuses on resources, benefits, and burdens, as well as equitable distribution and redistribution of those resources, benefits, and burdens. And then we also have structural, which is often or should be systems-oriented. It really looks at addressing root causes, maximizing benefits, and minimizing unintended consequences. And this is where emphasizing community leadership and decision-making can really be part of fundamental change. Now, projects can incorporate all 3 of these objectives, and this may be especially the case if your organization has started to embed these objectives into their work. At the same time, it's important to recognize that even if your organization isn't yet driving that systems level change, you don't have to wait. A key goal of all of this is to disrupt systems of power and privilege beyond a single project. However, a single project may be one piece of starting to move the needle on making major change. So we're going to move into an activity. Now, before doing that, I'm going to introduce it or introduce a tool that we're going to use for the activity. So for activity 1, we are going to spend some time exploring a tool that can be helpful for starting to consider how equity should be embedded into adaptation work. So the Wheel of Power and Privilege that you see on your screen is a valuable resource for recognizing the different ways that people exist in proximity to power. This proximity can influence how different voices are privileged in decision-making, their access to resources, how systems designed for the perceived majority serve or don't serve them, and more. Really, it can help to reflect on how you and the individuals and the communities that you work with, within, and are a part of exist in relation to different but often intersecting power structures. So moving outward from the most privileged position in the center of the wheel to the least privileged, or those who might face the highest number of barriers within each category, it can help you to reflect on the factors that shaped the various lived experiences of people within your community, including those experiences related to accessing municipal services and related to the impacts of climate change. Now, in some cases, these relationships may shift at different times and in different contexts. They also intersect with each other to inform lived experiences in different ways. So you may have heard the term intersectionality. And so that's what this connects to, is this idea of intersectionality that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And it refers to the idea that systems of power do not operate in isolation. If you haven't taken the time to learn more about it, I do recommend digging into some of the writing, the research, the actions based around intersectionality. Now, when it comes to adaptation work, this wheel can be used when considering the impacts of climate change to better reflect on the ways that inequity will compound these impacts and put certain groups at greater risk. Building off of this knowledge, it can also be used to inform project planning and implementation to better understand who your project, activity, or initiative will benefit, who might be excluded, who might face barriers to accessing the benefits, and or who might face unintended consequences as a result. Now, 2 notes on this resource is that 1, this version is American, and so may not perfectly apply to Canadian context. Regardless, it does a pretty good job of starting to put it down on paper. The other is that it is not a complete or conclusive list, nor does it make distinctions between how these relationships play out in different ways or to different degrees. But regardless, it is a great starting point reflecting on power differentials in your work and can be used across the work that you're doing. So we're going to move into activity 1, which is designed to apply the wheel of power to different adaptation actions. It'll involve the collective sharing of questions and reflections that consider who benefits or might be excluded, barriers to inclusion, and possible unintended consequences of certain actions.
Hello, everybody. It is really my pleasure meeting all of you today. So if you are ready, I'm just going to continue our presentation. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, so just move to my own slides. Perfect. So we would just like to move to a brief examples for you to just investigate how municipal discussions around climate change adaptation can be connected to equity. Recent research by Nature Canada shows that neighborhoods with lower household incomes and larger population of Black, Indigenous, and people of color usually have less access to trees and urban forests than wealthier and less culturally diverse communities. When it comes to climate change adaptation, we know that access to green spaces can act as a buffer against climate impacts. So neighborhoods that do not have enough access to green spaces usually are disproportionately at risk to poor air quality, health impacts of heat events, flooding, runoff, and hazards like that. Here is a couple of questions that municipal staff can consider when they're working on green infrastructure projects and they would like to include equity considerations. Do your plans look at intersecting barriers experienced by equity-deserving communities? How can you communicate this information to prioritize support for equity-deserving communities? And if you don't have information, how might you gather this knowledge and in collaboration with whom? Now, I would like to move to some examples that have considered considered equity in tree planting programs and green infrastructure programs. We recently attended a workshop by Sustainable Network and Nature Canada. In this workshop, some examples of these works with regards to tree equity were investigated. One example of them was the work developed by Calgary Climate Hub. The name of this project is a Calgary Tree Equity Hub project. The project includes a tree equity tool and a tree planting guide. The tree equity tool actually is a special tool that allows you to observe the special distribution of trees across different neighborhoods in Calgary, to see the changes in tree canopy over time, and to also see the tree equity score to understand which neighborhoods should be prioritized and how is the connections between tree equity and socioeconomic status. The tree planting guide actually is developed in close collaboration with communities that don't have access to trees. And this guide includes some community-based efforts for advancing to equity, recognizing that municipalities might not be fast enough in addressing to equity. Uh, the next example relates to connections between affordable and sustainable housing and equity. We all know that lack of access to quality housing for low-income people. There are several examples actually that this lack of access to affordable and sustainable housing can expose low-income communities to different risks, such as power outages, such as sewage backup, basement flooding, and hazards like that. So here are a couple of questions that municipalities can consider for including equity in affordable housing programs. Do your plans look at intersecting barriers of housing affordability and resilience? How can affordable, high quality, and climate resilient housing be prioritized as part of municipal resilience efforts? And who might be effective partners to help support this process? Uh, okay, just let's move to a research I conducted as part of my PhD studies at University of Waterloo. This research focuses on Turkey Park, which is a low-income neighborhood with a dense low-income population and a high percentage of actually several buildings that were built back in 1960s and 1970s with aging infrastructure, and the neighborhood has lack of access to public transportation and actually don't have enough green spaces. I interviewed with neighborhood residents and found that there have been several experiences of power outages after extreme weather events. They have experienced wet interior walls after extreme weather events, and they have also observed runoff events and flooding within their neighborhoods and health impacts of heat waves during summers because of lack of access to air conditioning. Despite all of these problems, when I was talking with neighborhood residents, I found that they are not concerned about climate change at all because they have more immediate needs. And I actually distributed some surveys within the neighborhood to understand their needs. And I found that affordable housing, 85% of respondents told me that affordable housing is their top priority need, followed by healthcare and employment. And surprisingly, protection against hazards is least prioritized by people. And I also found that residents did not have any experience participating in urban infrastructure planning decisions or green infrastructure projects and adaptation planning. I also found that there are four main serious barriers for public engagement in this neighborhood. The first barrier was lack of social networks. Most of the neighborhood residents were immigrants. They did not meet people outside of their community. Many of them even didn't have jobs or go to university or college, so they didn't have any connections in the Canadian system, the Canadian governance system, also community. The second barrier was a lack of citizenship rights. Several residents were refugees, so they were afraid to get in trouble if they participate in social activities or engagement processes if there were any. Even in my own work, when I like to approach people and interview them, many of them were not willing to participate because they were afraid. The third barrier was climate unawareness. Actually, people had limited knowledge on climate change and how climate change can impact their daily life and how they have to cope with emergency conditions. And the last barrier was communication barriers. Many of the neighborhood residents were not able to communicate in English. Many of them didn't have access to internet and social media because they were not able to afford that. There were cultural issues in the neighborhood. Religious views specifically prevented women to participate in social activities and engagement activities if there were any. And there were also livelihood barriers in the neighborhood. Many residents had to work even overnight or during weekends to be able to afford food and housing. So they didn't have spare time to participate in social activities and engagement processes. Let's move to a good example that is focusing on including the voices of equity-deserving communities in urban renewal and climate action projects through engagement. Back in 2012, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority applied its Sustainable Neighborhood Action Program on San Romano Bay Towers Revival Project. These towers are located at a low-income neighborhood at the intersection of Jane and Finch. Actually, Sustainable Neighborhood Action Program usually gathers and bring together different stakeholders such as tenants, property owners, nonprofit sectors, and also municipalities, and in this case, City of Toronto, businesses to just define the scope of the project and define the objectives. And in this neighborhood, they plan to improve resilience, environmental issues, and socioeconomic conditions within this neighborhood. The project applied the participants to leader model, which actively engage community members and foster community leadership. And a variety of engagement techniques were used to understand residents' needs and identify emerging leaders, such as through outdoor events, focus group discussions, and actually residence tours. The Sustainable Neighborhood Action Program usually supports quick starting projects to build trust, and they did the same for this program. And they quickly implemented several projects, and I have just bring here three examples of them. One of them was, for example, edible balconies. People were provided with some supports to just grow their own food in their balconies. The second one was urban agriculture project and training. There were some spaces were provided in the neighborhood so that residents can grow their own fruit trees and take care of them. And there were also trainings for them to learn how to take care of fruit trees and how to use these skills for their future green jobs. And the last project that I have included is related to building retrofits. There were some champions, green champions in the neighborhood that just were trying to elevate awareness and encourage people for sustainable ways of life, green life, through saving energy and measures like that. And there were also resources and some actual training for the residents for just letting them know what are their resources. They can refer to what are the municipal resources to retrofit their buildings through changing, for example, their electric bulbs or just repairing their water fixtures, things like that. So, yeah, so just before going to the break, I would like to ask you, would like to open up the space for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to copy and paste it in the chat here. We try our best to answer one or two questions, either now or at the end of session. But if we didn't have time to answer you, for sure we will come back to you and answer your question through email.
Hey, great. So we're going to thank you, Nilüfer, for sharing that. And again, we will share additional resources, the resources that have been mentioned throughout this presentation, as well as the session recording and slides with everyone after today's session. So for activity 2, I'm going to share my screen. Again, you should have all received the 2 worksheets in an email. I would recommend even pulling it up now. Otherwise, we have it dropped into the chat where you can re-download it for easier access. Okay, so I'm not going to go back to the presentation. I am going to share my screen with the worksheet. I will also say that over the break, I was just taking a look at the mural board that folks were adding their responses into, and it looked really, really fantastic. So again, I recommend you take a look after the session. You can also use it during this activity, and I will do my best to share those results with everyone after the fact. So, okay, so for activity 2, we're going to be building on the actions that we chatted about in the first activity, reflecting on how community engagement can support equitable adaptation solutions. Recognizing that engagement is an important part of the process, but again, as mentioned at the start of this presentation, it is not the only part of or kind of work that needs to take place when it comes to equity and incorporating equity into the adaptation work that is being done. And so we are going to spend some time, thinking about how not just to reach folks across a range of different communities, but what it means to actually make engagement processes inclusive. Recognizing that coming to equitable solutions requires that the processes for hearing and gathering input and collaborating must also themselves be equitable. So in breakout groups, again, recommend assigning someone as a note taker who can share their screen, even though everyone will have their own sheets. And together, everyone is going to, you will select an adaptation from activity 1. Again, I've listed them there for easy access for the work you're doing. Then what you're going to do is that you're going to imagine that you are undertaking an engagement process to ensure that community input is incorporated into project design and implementation for the action that you have selected. So there's 2 parts to this, and we will do our best to finish it in 20 minutes. And also it's okay if it doesn't all get finished in the 20 minutes that you have. These can just be helpful questions regardless for incorporating into the work that you're doing. So again, you're going to imagine that you're undertaking an engagement process to ensure that community input is incorporated into product design and implementation for this action. As a starting point, you want to reflect on who is likely to be impacted, both positively or negatively, by this action, and record your answers in the table on page 2. So you can see here, we've actually got in this first section is just what problem is the action trying to solve. Can be helpful as you're going through this to think about what the actual hazards are that the action is responding to and the impacts. So I wouldn't spend too much time on it. And then who is likely to be impacted by the problem or the solution. So, considering ways that certain groups or individuals might be impacted more or differently, and then considering who might benefit from the action more or less or not at all, or who might face negative outcomes as a result. Again, I would only spend, 3 to 5 minutes on this top section. You can use the mural board from activity 1, which is linked here, to support your reflections. And what I do want to note is that you're not going to have an answer or be able to identify every possible way in which this action might impact people. That is where the conversation on engagement and equity comes in, that we can't have every answer, but it is meant to prompt some thinking and reflection on that to help support the next part to the activity. So for the second part of the activity, you're going to brainstorm possible engagement, actions, activities, events to help support the community consultation process. So building on the reflection above, consider how to ensure that these activities are accessible to a maximum number of individuals and groups. So, what are some of the activities or events that could take place? What are some possible barriers to community participation in these activities for certain communities, equity deserving groups? How can you ensure that these activities are accessible to the widest number of people, or that they're able to meaningfully engage your community? So on that note, we will divide you again into breakout groups and you folks on that together.
I never see anybody's faces, so I think it's good we're doing questions at the end because I can't see everybody. So anyways, thanks for welcoming me into this space to talk about some inclusive action for the adaptation that we're doing in Dufferin County. So as Naomi mentioned, that I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about kind of our approach to it and then how we're actually implementing it on an ongoing project that is still very much active. So, which is our Community Resilience Hub project. Just want to start off with a land acknowledgement. So coming from Dufferin County, I don't know the breadth of where everybody is, but Dufferin County is just about north of Toronto, and it resides within the traditional territory and ancestral lands of the Tianantani, the Attawandaron, Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. Like I said, to talk a little bit about a tool that we developed. So I did something a bit broader and larger on a different webinar around this. So I'm just going to skip, I'm going to go through it pretty quickly because I have 10 minutes. But I'll really talk about how we've kind of taken this tool that we've developed and really applied it to the Resilience Hub project. So first, to start with the tool, why are we adopting the equity and climate lens tool? So this really came from a strategic priority from our our corporate strategic plan. And it's really, the tool is a reflection of all of the county's values, but in particular, we wanted to demonstrate the value of accountability every time we apply the tool. So there's kind of a process within all of that, but in even developing it and, you know, trying to align this with our long-term objectives and really try to better our community, we had to kind of think firstly about like, what did this actually mean to us? So from an equity lens perspective, the shared understanding that we developed internally before embarking on this whole thing was that an equity lens is really a process for analyzing or diagnosing the impact of design and implementation of policies and programs on underserved individuals and groups that experience marginalization, and to identify, mitigate, and potentially eliminate systemic barriers. Really long kind of thing. But I mean, it was something that we all kind of agreed upon with this. So using the lens, the whole point of it is to really disrupt and challenge the idea that policies, procedures, practices, projects that we do, and organizational culture are neutral. It really forces us to kind of ask these critical questions that examine power and privilege, and requires us to center the needs, impact, and outcomes of individuals experiencing marginalization so that disparities aren't further perpetuated while we're doing our work at the county. And the climate lens side of things, probably also very familiar to people, that this one wasn't, it was pretty more straightforward, I would say. But it is a mechanism to systemically analyze the relationship between a municipal decision and climate change. So it really kind of prompts us to, again, consider whether our policies, plans, projects, that kind of thing, if they affect the climate through the production of greenhouse gas emissions, or will be affected by the climate through variables, you know, like temperature, precipitation. And all of this is kind of underpinned by some other work that we've done around like climate declaration emergencies, our climate action plan. Of course, we have all of that kind of stuff that really underpin all of this. The one thing I'll note too is with the tool is that we understand that when we were going through all of this, the application of these lenses, and I'll talk this a little bit within the Resilience Hub project, it really requires staff to think about and approach their work differently. So that can take a little bit more time with things. But it also, with these changes, you know, we were trying to also provide some additional training that comes with it. But it is really important to start thinking about like changing norms and having those conversations about it, whatever it is that you're applying, both lenses. So that way people can do it with confidence as they move forward. So it's kind of what it looks like. I know people are going to ask me, is this public? And I keep saying not yet. And we are going to actually release something, at least to share with municipalities or people within the space, maybe not posted on the website, because we are still kind of working through it. And to be honest, it's kind of changing all of the time. We did do a launch corporately with the tool, but the whole point of this is to really try to enhance the equity, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and reduce our climate risks with it. But this, so like when the tool should be used, we say early and often, talk about all the ways that we have been applying it. I won't get into all of this on how we're doing a rollout, but we do try to encourage people to use it regularly. Okay, so embedding equity in the Resilience Hub pilot project. So we've taken this tool and we've filled it out. So I'll just share a little bit about how we've used this tool to try to embed equity in the Resilience Hub as much as possible. I'll also say, though, is that we understand that applying an equity lens is not like a one-time thing. It really happens in layers. We've seen this within the project. It happens at different phases and stages, and it doesn't just apply to the project. We've done it with like the engagement strategy within the project. So this is what I mean, that it is really much done in layers. But really, it's the whole idea is through that continuous practice that we really can deepen our understanding and improve the application of it to new projects as we do going forward. So about the Resilience Hub that we're proposing right now. So it's really designed to be a trusted kind of go-to location for community members. Beyond serving as just a gathering space, the whole idea is that it will help meet everyday needs, considering all of the climate modeling, and by providing a place for social interaction, community events, access to resources and whatnot. And really the goal is to create an inclusive space here that enhances both community connection and emergency preparedness. So this is done in collaboration with our emergency preparedness division. And we did have some ORCA staff from the staff capacity team help us out with the engagement on this project. So like here's some of our inspo, one of our projects that we took inspo from the city of Victoria. It's one of their neighbor hubs there. So props to anybody who's worked on that. I thought they were really cool. So very similar kind of thing, and we're working with some, which I'll talk about. So the idea for this too is that this project is we want it to be a bit of like a blueprint project. So beyond just going to creating a pilot hub, we're also looking to develop a bit of a comprehensive guidebook. So the guidebook will hopefully serve as a resource to expand community resilience hubs across Dufferin County and beyond. That we will have blueprints to actually share. These hubs, hopefully we're looking to establish them in maybe a variety of locations, could be like municipal offices, or places that people already go to, like libraries or community centers, places of worship, and other community spaces. So the whole point is that we're having these designs, but then also a guidebook to provide some practical steps and best practices to ensure the hubs can be effectively implemented and serve the communities around them well. I'll say why resilience hubs. This is kind of a slide I always put in when I'm explaining to people. We always like this. If you're going to get saved by disaster, it's most likely not going to be the hero in the cape. It's going to be your neighbor. Because some people are like, how is this climate action? It's like, well, it's actually exactly climate action, especially in adaptation, where we're really thinking about that social fabric and really trying to find ways to bring people together in public spaces and within whatever space they're in their community. Okay, so applying the lens to that project, like I said, we took an intentional approach by using the tool and began the process early, and we still treat it as a living document. So when we first applied it to the project design, which was one kind of a phase that we did, it helped us critically assess at the beginning who would be the most impacted, who needed to be involved with it. And like I said, we then continually kept applying it throughout the process, especially when it came to like engagement, like what does that engagement look like? Are we reaching the right people? There's lots of those questions that answers that we used in our strategy. And then this part, I'm just gonna linger on here because I think that this is just a really concrete example about what that actually ended up looking like. So as part of creating this hub, again, it wasn't just, some crazy ideas that I had. We did need to have really the resilience piece of it. And what does that actually mean to the community that it's about to serve? So we pulled together a community advisory group and we took a two-table approach to it. So this is really one of the most significant ways I think so far that we've been able to do this is structuring it into these two tables, because we thought about it in terms, the equity parts in terms of, I'll say the composition, the form, and the function of each of the tables. So the first one here, I'll just talk about is the public service review table, the light blue one. In terms of its composition, this group consists of stakeholders from organizations like we'll have the community paramedics, we have public health, we have OPP, conservation authorities, municipal staff. So that's who's involved with that in terms of composition. In terms of the form, these members participate as part of their jobs. So we know they get paid to be there. And so the meetings are all held virtually, all during the workday hours in which they're paid. And the function of them is really to provide some functional safety, or it's functional and safety oversight for the project. But the whole point is that they do take their lead on this from the community advisory table. So the public service review table meets after and separately as more of a bit of a checks and balances, I'll say. And the community advisory table, so the composition of that table is representatives from the community. We have, including like the Dufferin County Canadian Black Association, we have an Anishinaabe knowledge keeper, sustainability advocates from organizations and just those in the community and youth. There's other people too, but that's just to give an idea of who's involved with that. In terms of form with that table, it meets outside of work hours, which means so do we. In the evenings, mostly because most of them have jobs, daytime jobs anyway. And members are compensated by the county for their time. So we do have we have a committee policy that we do pay $100 a meeting. So the whole idea of that is really so we are valuing people's contributions around there and acknowledging that, if we have the public service review table gets paid for their time, so why wouldn't somebody from the community that has equal amounts, if not more, lived experience and contextual experience to offer when creating a public space that's going to serve them. The other part of this too, in terms of just kind of the form with it, is that the reason that these were separate is that given the participants have a complicated or uncomfortable history with organizations like the OPP, we created this separate table to make sure we could foster like an open and meaningful dialogue. You know, I mean, I keep saying this, I'm like, if I was a teenager and I had to be on the same committee as some OPP, like, I don't know if I would want to be there. Like, maybe that was just me as a teenager, but, and then again, I think more seriously, very much so for with Indigenous trauma that's associated with that from historical trauma. So really making sure that we're considering power structures when we're thinking about these tables and how people engage within there. And then so the function of this table for the community advisory table, it's just, it meets first, like I mentioned, and it's really to prioritize the visioning and design decisions that are in here. So they meet before the public service review table, and they help define what resilience means. What do they want to see? And we did have some also, I should mention, broader public engagement. So we would do that and then turn to that public advisory table, and then the project designers as well to have a little bit more of a detailed discussion on that. And the designers will be developing options for us. They actually have, and I can't share those quite yet, but we just got them last week. They're very cool. And the community advisory table was very pleased, so which was great. So we're going to do some. There still needs to be some feedback and updating with them, but broadly it was very well received, which was really nice. And then kind of last here, I'll talk about engagement with officials. I know I'm kind of running out of time. So we went to a lot of the official committees as well to go back and forth with them. Like we've been there, I don't know, I think 14 times across four different committees. So really the idea of going back and having that continuous feedback loop, so it's not just a consulting one and done, does take time, obviously. And a lot of these committees also meet in the evening. So it has actually forced us to shift sometimes our working hours to account for some of that over time. So that's really something too that we've tried to prioritize in there. And again, the going back piece of it and the accountability piece is important. I'll just share the importance of kind of going to one of those committees. One of the was Access Orangeville, so an accessibility committee. And it was interesting. This is the type of feedback you can get from people in this when you go to them, is that one of the members there said, you know, this really sounds like a nice open space that you're proposing here. And I was like, yeah, and, you know, at that time it was still in the design phase, but we aim to make it as open and as versatile as possible. And the member said, you know, somebody with balance issues, wide open spaces without support structures actually really scare me. Will there be handrails there? I thought it was like, oh, I didn't even think about that before. I'm like, well, will be now. They will put them in. And again, so because of those lived experiences, that's really what makes the project even better as we're actually going through and talking to people. Again, we're going to use the space. Imagine that. So really kind of, you know, whether we go for inclusive design with things, there are certainly things that we missed, and it is those contextual experts that I think with the lived experience that really can transform spaces into being truly accessible and locally relevant as well. And I just say it's kind of just last little bit here, I guess, the moving forward. These are just another inspo piece from Parks in Action, which is the professor who is involved in designing this is actually involved in the design of ours as well. So that's been really helpful. So you can kind of see these are kind of cool, funky spaces. I feel like ours are even better. But I'll say the project is really far from over at this point. Like I said, just the preliminary designs came in, but really we're still prioritizing equity at every stage and going back to our lens tool and kind of refining it and keep applying all of the lessons learned with it. And hopefully we'll be able to use those kind of as we go forward into the next project.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing. That was great. I appreciate you being so speedy with your time, but also just sharing in general. So we wanted to actually take this moment to open the floor up to any questions folks might have for Sarah. So please feel free. Maybe we can even unspotlight ourselves, and if anyone wants to raise a hand and ask a question directly, feel free.
I was curious, thanks so much for that presentation. It's really interesting and inspirational. I was curious how you identify the initial structure, like that you needed to have, what process you went through to say, okay, well, we need this community group, this sort of the structure that you presented with the 4 different tables and then the central project team, and how that developed.
Yeah, sure. So you mean like the governance structure, like the community table and all that stuff? Or do you mean like the structure of like the physical one that will be there?
The governance structure.
Okay. I mean, actually, I will say, to be honest, one of the things that I took a bit of and again, this is, you know, you just do things and you get inspiration from other places. One of them, I sit on the local leadership for climate adaptation through a table, an advisory table through FCM. And they had a really great, I thought, structure within that, where there was like an advisory group, but then like some of the tables had some, like I'm on the small municipal table. So like that's a very specific table that has somewhat of a shared experience with things. And so you could have much more of a rich conversation within that. So I mean, to me, that was actually a little bit of the inspiration for the tables in a way. But then again, also like when we went through the equity and climate lens, layering, again, this is the layered piece I find. Layering that into it is really, again, thinking about who's going to be at the table, what are those power differentiated structured there. And there was a few things even, and again, it wasn't always so clear cut. So like, for instance, we have somebody actually who sits on the community advisory table who's a municipal staff, but they work, I believe that she's actually called the community pedagogist and works with children's services and early on, but really because she has such community experience with that, we wanted her on that table. So it wasn't always so cut and dry with certain things. But again, the other part of it that was helpful was the partnership with our emergency preparedness division, who had a lot of those relationships and was like, you know, I think we need to have X, Y, Z within these people within it. And then even to be honest, we had a meeting and we realized we kind of missed some people even after the first meeting. So there's been a bit of fluid nature of some of it too. There's flexibility has certainly had to be built into the whole thing. So, I mean, again, it was just kind of a process. We didn't have to get anything approved or anything like that. We just went ahead with it. Small municipalities, again, there's not a lot of red tape, which is for better or worse sometimes. But, you know, we could just kind of go ahead with that, set it in terms of reference, and then kind of move on with it.
Amazing. Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much.
Thanks, Jessica, for asking the question. There were a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to share. So one from Natalie that said, did you face any resistance from staff when designing and implementing this tool? I imagine referring to the equity lens, but yeah.
Yeah, it's still ongoing. It was funny actually. So, oh, man, it's been like 2 years in the making. We've had a lot of conversations, about it. Yeah, in so much level, I think when you're introducing any type of new way of doing anything, especially with limited resources, and I know, and I'm part of this too, is staff are tapped for a lot of stuff these days. So a lot of the things in which we were trying to think about with it is that one, I mean, I just presented this to our corporation, was it earlier this week? I don't remember the weeks anymore, but it was recently. And part of it was, I explained even the application of it to the resilience hub, was that it just made for a better project. So like, it's not just another like checkbox thing that you go and do, like, so that's kind of part of it in it to an extent, but it made for better projects. So like, if you care about your work that you're doing, it's going to make it better. And so, but the other part of it too, is that when we're, thinking about it being a standalone document right now, as we're thinking about implementation, where right now it's relatively voluntary, but strongly encouraged because it will be made mandatory within, by 2026 or in 2026, I should say. Is it how do we identify other people's workflows and their processes, and how do we integrate the tool into those things? So it's not just this standalone thing that they can easily forget about. And an example of that, which I think would be an easy-ish one to do, will be around procurement. So our procurement thresholds are $75,000 for RFP. So at that point, we're like, okay, well, we'll do, because again, they have to go through a process within there. How can we embed the equity and climate lens portion of that into there? So that way, when they're designing the RFP right from the beginning, they think about those things. That part of it is going to change if they have, again, depending on the project. If they're going to be doing an engagement piece within there, they may have to add more things into that, and it may increase the cost of the project. One of the questions that's actually in the climate or the lens tool, but it's both in the equity part and the climate part, is what could you do differently within this? And you have to list stuff. So it's encouraging people to do a bit of like a Google search, you know, nothing crazy. What are some other best practices? What could you do? What are the resources that you would actually need to do that thing? And so, and those resources, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's time, sometimes it's data. It could be knowledge, it could be people, it could be a lot of things. What are the things you need to actually push that forward? And because this was something that was in the corporate strategic direction, we will be, again, this is part of the mandatory rollout part of it, but it will get integrated then into council reports. And so if there needs to be additional budget that's associated with it, they know exactly how much the equity and climate lens is costing, or whatever that is. So if they choose not to do it, that's on them. I mean, that's still a council decision to say no to things, of course. But at least now we're being clear about what that is and what they are saying no to. So that's a helpful piece, I think, within there. But again, really coming back to like integrating it into certain things. I'll just say another maybe example of it. And again, trying to get almost creative with the tool where sometimes it may not be a full fill out in every single thing. Is that working on a project now on doing a climate risk assessment on our public infrastructure, which by the way, short forms to crappy. So I call it the crappy project, even though it's going to be great. But with that one, again, we're looking at road infrastructure that may change, that may impact engineering designs that we have. So if that's the case, in a lot of ways, we're looking at roads, the climate lens was like applied, right? Like they may not have to go through and do it for every single project. So there are any kind of other ways of applying it. Again, it's really trying to get a bit creative and understanding where those workflows are, so that way you're trying to reduce the amount of resistance as much as possible, while also shifting, like maybe just sneakily, maybe it's manipulation. I don't know. Maybe it's for the good though, but like for the better. I don't know. So yeah, just trying to get creative in some of that stuff to not just like add a thing, another thing in there that's a thou shall, because nobody ever wants to get told they have to do something all of the time. And then you just, it gets met with resistance when this is supposed to be something that, you know, again, increases the making your projects better. So long way.
No, that was great and really helpful. So thank you. There's a couple other questions in the chat. If anyone else has any others, feel free to drop them in. Probably have time for 2 or 3 more. So have you got any advice on keeping high participation, specifically like thinking about the tables that you work with over the long term?
Yeah, I mean the public service table is pretty easy because I mean, to be honest, it's just people we work with and we bring them to a table and they have to be at an hour meeting and they give their input on stuff. Like that's kind of what they're paid to do. So that one's like relatively straightforward. The community one can always be a challenge. One of the things that I think that we do pretty well with it, and we have had pretty good attendance with things, with all of our meetings, is that they're very well planned. They are very engaging in a way. And again, one of the things that we do and we bring back to each of them is like, okay, here's what we heard the last time. And they can actually see where their input is actually changing things. Because the worst thing ever, and I'm sure many people have been in engagement situations where you feel like it's very one way. And you just feel like you give some input and then it just goes like off into the abyss. And you're like, well, I gave my time to this. So like, what's happening with it? So some of it is about that accountability. So when we bring people back, and again, I think it's helpful now that they actually see the designs, that it's like a real thing. They're very excited about the designs. And we did a really great prioritization exercise, like that was run. So the professor and the students work with is a partnership between TMU and University of Toronto. And they had a mural board and all their ideas, in which were their inspo for the designs based off of our engagement that we gave them. And it was a little like, it was like a virtual democracy thing, and people were putting their comments in and stuff. And it was actually really like well participated in. So I think is some of that, you know, you have some good, you just have some good meeting structure where they understand why they're there, what they're getting out of it, and that they're actually feeling that their contributions matter. So it is very much about setting, I think, that tone early on. And making sure that they do kind of feel that, so they feel a lot more confident in coming back because they want to come to the meeting because it's, you know, you're doing a cool project.
And then there's another question here from Harry. As an upper tier municipality, how did you determine the number and location of the hubs?
Oh yeah, this one's kind of like easy-ish. The number of them, well, we have 1 right now. And actually I'll say this. So we for the first one, because I know that this is a type of project where my colleague Carly has talked a little bit about this, that some of the challenge in communicating on this project, it's like, oh, it's a resilience hub, and you're like, people are like, what is that, especially to council. And so we knew that that was a bit of a challenge in the communication, very like, it was an abstract almost idea with it. And so I knew there's going to be a bit of an uphill battle in a cell. And so the first one, to be honest, we were just lucky. It's going to be on our property. First and foremost, it's on municipal property. We're owning it. I understand that best practices would be that the community should decide where it goes. And I get that. And in future ones, we will certainly be looking at that kind of model. But I think for the first one, and I call it as like a proof of concept type of thing, that we needed to have a little bit more control, I think, over where it was going to go so that we can make sure it was in place. However, we were originally going to put it right near our office has a transit hub. and a community garden, and there was kind of an area there, and there's also a public orchard, so people can go and pick fruit. It's really lovely. And so we're like, oh, that would be a great spot for it. And we actually held an in-person meeting there with our community advisory table, so that way people could kind of experience the space as we were doing some co-visioning of it. And as we were in there, and again, we were doing this in the evening, it started getting dark, and like there's a lot of women who sit on that committee, and we were all like kind of like didn't feel safe as it started to get darker, and we realized it was kind of a little bit set back, and we're like maybe we need to think about not having it here just for that reason. So I mean, even being in this space, there was a lot of learning right there with it. And so we kind of shifted a little bit. So it's a little bit closer to our building now, kind of still with it's like 100 meters away maybe. So still access to that there. And so again, like as a proof of concept, I think we're going to start with that one, but then going forward, the whole idea is if these blueprint designs that we have will be made available to something like the Lions Club. Like if we even have a neighborhood that heard about this and they reached out and they're like, we want one of these in our neighborhood. And we're like, great, hold on. We can help with the permitting and all of that kind of stuff, but it will really be on whatever group has this to do fundraising, to make sure that they have kind of a community stewardship agreement, who's doing what. Like there are some, I'll say administrative elements around where they will go. But anyway, so like, I mean, again, that's kind of probably I would call it even like phase 3 at this point, because we just have to get one built first. That's kind of the idea. So it was a bit of a selfish thing also because it's close to our building and stuff, but hoping to just have it so it's a success on the first one so we can do duplication.
Okay, thank you again, Sarah, for answering all those questions, and thank you everyone for sharing those questions. As with the whole session, if you have any other questions that arose today, or want to just reach out to us and chat about something, please feel free. I will pass it over now to Nilüfer to close things out.
Yeah, a big thank. I would like to say just a big thanks to Sarah for sharing the amazing project at the Dufferin County. Thank you so much. And just before ending the meeting, I would like to just update you that there are a couple of resources that we will share with you through email after this session. We would like to present them in this meeting, but unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to do that. And again, before closing the meeting, there is a survey that my colleague Ari is sharing in the chat. We will appreciate if you can just put 2 minutes to complete it. Your insights are really valuable for us. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. It was our pleasure meeting you all.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.